All right, who were we studying last time?
Phoenicians.
The Phoenicians. And what do you remember about them? They were merchants. They became expert seafarers. What did they trade as merchants? Without looking.
Glass.
Glass,
Purple.
purple dye, which came from what?
Snails.
Not snails exactly.
Murex.
Murex. Right. What else did they trade? What? Timber. And what did they? How did they? What did they have that enabled them to cut down the timber? That they also traded. Axes made out of
Iron.
iron. And do you remember from where they got the iron?
Iron ore.
What people? I mean.
The Hittites?
Hittites. Good. Anything else they traded?
Did they do the dung beetles?
Say glass. Dung beetles?
Like as decorations? Or was that the
That was the Egyptians. Yeah. Did you say everything? Oh no, it's one more thing that we did say that mostly came out of the city of Byblos.
Roy.
On
Tablets?
no,
Ivory.
no. Papyrus or paper. And remember the city of Byblos became known for that. And so what word do we get from Byblos? Bible or book. Yeah. All right. Now, the last time we were looking at the different kinds of glass, and we had talked about transparent, colorless glass that was used for mirrors and also vases, things like that. Then the semi-transparent colored glass, which would be small flasks or bottles that contain perfume, for example, colored with different stripes sometimes, like these, either in horizontal or longitudinal, sometimes having zigzags, as you see on this one. Sometimes having crescents and curves. See some curves there, probably. So, transparent, colorless glass, semi-transparent, colored glass. Oh, by the way, does anybody know how they got colors in it?
If they dyed the sand.
Where did they get? What did they mix in the sand? At least this is my understanding of even today.
I heard people used to use beetle juice.
Beetle juice?
Yeah, like they crush beetles in the juice.
Yeah, that could be. Sometimes they would just use metals. You know, if you mix a little iron in, what color would you get?
You get
Oh, red.
Yeah. What are some other colors that you get from different metals?
Wait.
You want a little silver in, what would you get? Silver, yeah. Orange from what? Maybe mix a little iron with something else. Or you keep brown. So mixing certain metals in, you would get colors. Crush some beetles, you might get another color. Plants. All right, so they made these different colors. All right, the third kind of glass was opaque glass. O-P-A-Q-U-E. What does opaque mean? Right. So light doesn't go through it. So these would be things like porcelain. And again, they would use metallic oxides to bring the color. So this would be some of the painted pottery. Looks like that might be porcelain. Yeah,
Is the guy holding that tablet art? Is he royalty because he's wearing a bunch of purple?
He's a merchant. You know, how does it look if your merchant is dressed real shabbily trying to sell you expensive stuff? Have you ever gone into a men's store that sells expensive suits? How are the guys dressed that are selling those suits?
They have the same.
Yeah. If they were wearing just, not even wearing a tie, just a polo shirt, you know, that doesn't really entice you to buy a suit. But we see the merchant in purple say, I want that too, right? So I think that's the reason for him being dressed that way. All right, some other things on here that maybe we didn't talk about, but mostly we have what it is that they traded. Oh, I guess we didn't talk about papyrus yet. That's why you didn't come up with that. The next one is papyrus. The next thing they traded was papyrus, with the city of Byblos being the main center for the flourishing trade. In the other class, we had gotten to that before, but we hadn't gotten there in this one. All right, so those are the things they traded. Any question about their trade items?
What they used to make cloth, like normal cloth.
What? I don't know. I'm not sure what kind of cloth. I mean, certainly if they had wool, that would be from sheep. What are the cloth they had? If they had things like flax, they could, plants like that, they could make cloth out of that. I'm not sure what all they used to make cloth. Any other? Before what? Four items they traded. We have timber, purple dye, glass, and papyrus. Does that do it for you? Any other questions? Now, something else that the Phoenicians are given credit for is developing our present-day alphabet, or the basis of our alphabet. This is a chart I found that shows you the original hieroglyphic words. What the description of that is, you can see, a fence, okay, a man praying, a fish. You can see some of those. Some of those you might have to just kind of scratch your head to see if it really does picture that or not. And then the Hebrew name for those that develop from it. Most of these, some of these look like the Hebrew letter, but not most of them. Some of them may be. Here's the Phoenician script that came from these. If you look at this and then the Old Greek, you can see some similarity between a lot of them. And then those Old Greek letters came to be more modern Greek and then Latin. So the letters we use are really Latin letters. But they say that they came from the Phoenician script, taking these word pictures and make them into letters. Okay? All right. I have a hard time seeing how some of them develop. There's probably some stages in between that we don't see. All right, so they are credited with developing an alphabet that's the basis of what we use today. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the religion of the Phoenicians. They had three main gods, and others after that. First, they had a god of the city. So each city had their god. And then there was the goddess of fertility. And she's pictured here. Astarte would be the goddess of fertility. I'm not sure whether Baal-Haman would, I think he probably was a city god. I'm not sure about him. And then there was a young god. And I don't know that Melkart fits that description, but most of the Phoenicians had these three designations. And of course the name would be different in different cities, or could be. The city of Tyre is before we go on, let's take a look at the picture here. Here you see a stone altar with a lamb on it for sacrifice. Here's the priest ready to kill the lamb. Here's a young girl with flower offerings. The main city for the Phoenicians was the city of Tyre. Sidon was also an important port city, and they're only about 20 miles apart here on the coast. And we'll talk more about Tyre later. The greatest influence that the Phoenicians had was at the time of Solomon. So when Israel is having her golden age, the Phoenicians have their most influence in this part of the world, I would say. They have an influence beyond when they, through some of the colonies they established, like the colony of Carthage. They would continue on for centuries. But their most prosperous time was when Israel was also prosperous. They did a lot of trade with Israel during the time of Solomon. All right. Any questions about the Phoenicians? For the Phoenicians, the main things to remember are that they were merchants, and remember the things that they traded, and the important cities, especially Tyre. Okay, let's go on to the next group of people, called the Aramaeans. Now, the Aramaeans are sometimes called Syrians. And I think that the best way to approach this is the same way that we did Canaan. Remember we said that a lot of different tribes of people lived in the land of Canaan, and so any of them might be called Canaanites, even though they weren't descendants of Canaan. Remember us talking about that? I think the same thing is true of Syria. There are different people that are going to live in Syria over time, and any one of them might be called Syrians. But the Aramaeans are the ones that we're looking at now. And in the Bible, sometimes they are called Syrians. The Aramaeans live in this area. You can see here is the Dead Sea. Here's the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River. And so they're right up to the edge of northern Israel on the other side of the Jordan. And so Damascus is their main city. They conquered this territory, and then they expanded further up into former Hittite territory. So they're up in here. You may recognize some of the cities there as well. The Aramaeans were known for their brutality and military conquests. Here is a drawing of them going to war. You can see on horses, and chariots, and the weapons that they have there in their hands. They were eventually able to take control over the territories between Egypt and Mesopotamia by around 1200 BC. So if you look at the map over here, from Egypt all the way over to Mesopotamia, and that is part of that Fertile Crescent, is also trade routes. Because you don't go across here, if you want to trade between Egypt and Babylon, you don't go across here. Why? Yeah, you wouldn't make it, probably. All right, so the trade routes go this way. And plus there are cities all along the way to trade too. Because the Aramaeans controlled this area, and they didn't do it with a heavy hand like a lot of civilizations do. But they had control to the extent that if you wanted to trade anywhere in that area, you needed to speak their language, which is Aramaean. So their language was spread throughout that region, and everybody learned how to speak Aramaean or Aramaic. It came to be called as well. The fact that the Aramaeans controlled the trade routes made them very wealthy, and so they became very prosperous. And as I said, people began to learn Aramaean language in order to communicate. Aramaic is similar to Hebrew and Arabic, and so even by the time you get to the New Testament, the time of Jesus, the people in Israel are not speaking Hebrew; they're speaking Aramaic. But sometimes it's called Hebrew because it's similar. Some portions of the Bible, in fact, were written in these territories and were written in Aramaic. So Aramaic becomes a very important language. All right, that's the Aramaeans. Do you have any question about them? The main thing they contribute is their language. It becomes the language of the area. Okay, next let's go on to a people that we know a lot about, the Hebrews. You know, we start out with Abraham in the city of Ur, from which God calls him. He goes over to the promised land of the land of Canaan. You know that eventually Jacob and his sons go into Egypt because Joseph is there. They're eventually put in bondage in Egypt. They're slaves. And then they are led out in the Exodus away from Egypt back towards their promised land once again. Now, here are some of the symbols that are associated with the Hebrew religion. Of course, Yahweh is the name of the God of the Hebrews. You see here pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are simply emblematic of the fact that God's Word was written for them on scrolls. That was a very important part of the religion. The Ark of the Covenant was a symbol of God's presence with them, as He was said to dwell in the tabernacle through the Ark of the Covenant. These are angels that are on top of the covenant with their wings overspread over the mercy seat. The mercy seat was where the high priest would come once a year to sprinkle blood to atone for the sins of the people for that year. And does anybody know the name of the day that he comes into the Holy of Holies to sprinkle blood on the mercy seat? We call it Day of Atonement, or in Hebrew, Yom Kippur, on the 9th of this month is Yom Kippur. So just in a couple days, many Jewish people will be celebrating that. Also associated with the Hebrew religion are prophets, people that give God's revelation to the nation. Now, this really shouldn't be here because this is an anachronism. You know what an anachronism is? It's like when Shakespeare puts a clock back in a time before clocks were invented. Anachronism is using something later in an earlier time when it didn't exist. They weren't called Jews until after the Babylonian exile. And that's because it was primarily the tribe of Judah that was carried into Babylon. And so the short for Judah is Jews. So they weren't called Jews back then. We should be careful to call them Hebrews or Israelites and not Jews. All right. Then here we have a menorah, the 7, not candlestick, oil, it was an oil lamp that was used in the tabernacle and then later the temple. All right. Any questions about any of these symbols or anything else that associated with the Hebrew religion? I almost said Jewish. The Hebrew religion.
Is that what they use for Hanukkah?
Yes, and we'll explain why sometime later.
Okay.
Good. I'm glad you're inquisitive about these things, but we'll talk about that in due course. Any other questions? All right, let's talk about the political situation at the time of the conquest. Who is it that leads the children of Israel into the promised land? Everybody say it together.
Joshua.
What? That was Joshua. Thank you. Joel led the way on that one. Joshua led the people into the promised land, and of course they were to conquer that land. Well, what was it like? Well, Canaan at the time, remember, was a province of Egypt. Remember, they had been under the Hyksos, and when Egypt drove the Hyksos out of Egypt, they also drove them out of the land of Canaan, and Egypt took over. But remember that under Egypt rule, Egypt did organize them into city-states, so each city had a king, more or less, and then that king was responsible to Egypt. So the larger cities were ruled by a native king who then paid tribute to Egypt. And remember that Egypt was not trying to develop the land like the Hyksos had, not make it prosperous like the Hyksos had. They just wanted to get what they could out of it. So the larger cities paid tribute, and these cities were well fortified. The military power was enlarged by local princes with chariots, and foot soldiers, which were the common people. So they had large cities, they were well fortified, and they had military to back up these cities. Now, as I mentioned, there was a decline in the Canaanite civilization under Egyptian rule. There was heavy taxation and corrupt administration because Egypt wasn't concerned with doing what was good for the people. They just wanted to get as much money as they could. The social organization then ended up deteriorating as well, leading to no middle class. Because when an economy is going poorly, eventually the middle class is going to suffer and going to disappear. And with no middle class, then there's no expenditure made toward developing arts or crafts. And so people who are artists, whether it be art to enjoy or art like being able to make things out of metal or stone, those kind of smithing kind of occupations cease to exist. So the civilization of the land of Canaan digressed rather than progressed. It digressed. Now the third thing we want to understand about the Canaanites is their religion. Even worse than the economic depression into which they went was the spiritual and religious depression. I want to tell you a little bit about the Canaanite religion. It may be stated without exaggeration that the Canaanite religion was the most sexually perverted, morally depraved, and bloodthirsty of all ancient history. In fact, that's the reason why God ordered Joshua to exterminate their very culture, citizens, and cities. See, a lot of times people say, oh, how can you believe in a God that would tell his followers to go into a country and kill everybody? Well, here's why. Because these people had the most awful religion ever in ancient history. It included human sacrifice, sacred prostitution, that is, women giving their bodies to men who came to the temple as a form of worship. They had eunuch priests, which are priests that are castrated, and oftentimes eunuchs are used for sexual gratification for males, homosexual acts, which were considered a form of worship. They had serpent priests, snakes, and they had a brutal mythology, which I'll describe more in detail in a moment. The head god of the Canaanites was El, which is the similar abbreviation that we have for Elohim for the Hebrews. So here's El. His wife was Asherah. She's a beauty, isn't she? His son was Baal. His daughter over here is Anat. Now, El also married his 3 sisters, one of whom was Astarte. El had 70 children, the most famous being Baal. El killed his brother and some of his own sons. He then cut off his daughter's head, castrated his father, castrated himself, and compelled his confederates, those who were with him, to do the same. Now, this was not just some lunatic running around the countryside. This was their God doing this. The sister of Baal was Anat. She became the vile and vicious goddess of passion, war, and violence. She fought Baal's enemies, because Baal oftentimes would get himself into situations that he couldn't handle, because he was a little bit of a bumbler, and Anat would always come and bail him out. She was the older sister that would come along and help out her younger brother, because he kept getting into messes. So that's the way they worked. The Baal epic of Ugarit depicts her like this. Listen to the description of Anat. With her might, she mowed down the dwellers of the cities. She struck down the people of the seacoasts. She destroyed the men of the east. She drove men into her temple and closed the doors so that no one could escape. She hurled chairs at the youths, tables at the warriors, footstools at the mighty men. She waded up to the knees, up to the neck in blood. Human heads lay at her feet. Human hands flew over her like locusts. She tied the heads of her victims as ornaments upon her back. Their hands she tied upon her belt. Her liver was swollen with laughing. Her heart was full of joy. When she was satisfied, she washed her hands in streams of human blood before turning again to other things. And she was called the Holy One. You get a picture of the religion? She was a sadistic sex goddess and a prostitute, and she was the Holy One. The name Baal, I wanted to show you, I forgot to show you the picture of Anat there with the blood all over. The name Baal can be translated Lord. In fact, there's a time when Sarah calls Abraham Baal. So it's kind of can be a generic term, just like Lord is for us sometimes. The title is given to the storm god Hadad, Baal Hadad. Since Baal brought rain, he is also credited with bringing the annual crops that were dependent on the rain. In the Ugaritic myths, Baal is portrayed as a mighty, lustful, and ambitious deity, but also as a god with decidedly more muscles than brains. His worshippers clearly enjoyed a good story about Baal charging into a situation through sheer bravado, only to discover too late that it was really a dumb thing to do. Baal relied primarily on his sister Anat to rescue him from these difficulties of his own making. Though others, such as Pothar and Hasis, who is a skilled artisan deity, Shapshu, the sun goddess, Asherah, and El, who were the rulers of the pantheon, helped him as well. Now, we understand some of this background of Baal. It helps you to see what's going on later on Mount Carmel. Remember when Elijah is battling against the prophets of Baal? Are you familiar with that? He was there on the mountain to get the people to decide whether they're going to worship Baal or whether they're going to worship Yahweh. And so the contest is set up that the God that brings down fire on the sacrifice is the true God. Well, that's a no-brainer for Baal. He's the God of lightning, right? The prophets of Baal probably thought, we got this in the bag. Man, this guy played right into our hand here. But they're out there screaming and shouting and cutting themselves, and they can't get Baal's attention. So Elijah makes fun of Baal, just like the people kind of normally did. He said, oh, maybe he's gone away. Maybe he's gone on vacation, and so he doesn't hear you. And later on he says, well, maybe he's relieving himself, and so he's not available to send. So he's making fun of Baal. But that's the kind of God Baal was, the kind you'd make fun of. And of course, they don't bring fire down because there is no God Baal. So Elijah, as you know, calls on Yahweh to bring down fire. He sends down fire, which not only burns up the sacrifice, but also laps up all the water that they had poured around in the ditch around the altar, and the people recognize that Yahweh is the Lord. As a result of that, Elijah then kills over 400 Baal prophets who were there, and runs down the hill before the rain comes. Read the whole story. Yes?
If they recognize that he is Lord, why did he still kill the priests?
Because they're the ones that are influencing people. Number one, they deserve to die for the false religion that they propagated. Secondly, you don't want them to continue doing it. So he killed them. But Jezebel was not there. And Jezebel, as you may remember, threatened to kill Elijah. And so he stood up to 400 prophets of Baal, but he couldn't stand up to one woman. And so he took off running, which is another interesting part of what happens there. All right. So that's Baal. Now let's look a little at what happens as Israel invades the territory. The invasion of the land of Canaan takes place in three parts. The theology of the conquest is related to what I've just told you about the religion. The real purpose was preservation of the revelation given to Israel. And going back to even later on, we see how important that was, because if you don't get rid of the false religion of the Canaanites, it's going to affect the people, the Israelites are coming in, and eventually they'll lose the law. How do we know that would happen? Because it did happen later. As Israel turned away from God, they didn't even know where a copy of the law was. And so we're going to find later that there's going to be times when God brings revival to Israel, and one of the things that happens is they find the law. Nobody knew where it was. And so what happens when false religion comes in? God's law goes out. Don't we find that true in our own country, even in our own lives? As other things come in, God's word goes out. And pretty soon God's word doesn't become important at all, even in some of our churches. And certainly not in our country. So this was a protection of God's revelation to Israel, given to his law. And also, it was for the good of the nations around. I mean, the religion of the Canaanites was awful, awful, awful. And in order to preserve the nations around, it was necessary to get rid of this terrible religion, the most debased in the world. All right, any comments or questions about, oops, I thought I had that up there, about justification for destroying the people and the religion?
They kill like all of them, like everybody in the whole region.
Yep. Well, they're supposed to. They didn't always do that. In fact, there's people that disguise themselves. I think I'll talk about that in a few minutes. That they didn't kill. Now, one thing to remember is that the Holy War is not unique to Israel. Other nations conducted what we call Holy War, that is, fighting for their God against the gods of other nations. And it's interesting that Israel follows a procedure that is very similar to what we find in other nations around too. I won't go into detail on that, but just to let you know that Israel wasn't the only one that fought for their God against other nations. All right, so let's look at the boundaries of the Promised Land. You can see that it goes all the way down here to the Brook of Egypt in the south, and up to Mount Hor in the north, Zadad, and it also includes land on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Remember, some of the tribes, when they were going into the land, said, you know, we prefer the land over here. We'll help you drive out the Canaanites, but let us come back here. And Joshua said that would be okay as long as they helped with the rest of it. Now, this is the basic campaign strategy of Joshua as he's coming into the land. And we'll look at that a little bit. Before we do that, though, we want to understand the advantages of the Canaanites. All right, what did the Canaanites have? First of all, they had experienced armies. Are the Israelites experienced armies? Well, they had to fight some battles along the way, but they weren't really an army. They were just people, common people. But they're going up against those that were experienced. Secondly, the Canaanites had chariots. Remember when Tutmos III came up and battled against the Hittites at Megiddo? No, that was Kadesh. It was the Battle of Megiddo. It was the Battle of Megiddo. Tutmos III captured over 900 chariots. So we know that chariots were used a lot in that area. Thirdly, they had fortified cities. The cities had big walls, thick walls. Fourthly, the Canaanites were used to forming alliances. So they would gather, even though each city was their own government, they would form alliances with other cities and say, let's all join together and fight against this common enemy. Now, as we look at what happened then as Joshua comes in to conquer the land, first of all, we see him coming into the center camping at Gilgal and then attacking Jericho. Gilgal would be a real center of the people and the worship of God for some time to come. They took Jericho. As you know, the walls came tumbling down. At Ai, they weren't successful because of Achan taking things from Jericho for himself when God said, don't take anything. And remember, people died in that battle because of Achan. But they continued on in the center region. And this is where Joshua made peace with Gibeon. The Gibeonites pretended that they were from real far away and wanted to make an alliance with Joshua. When in reality, they were just from over the hill. They did that to keep from getting killed because they knew that Joshua and the Israelites were going to come in and kill everybody. And Joshua made a treaty with them, found out later they'd lied. He wouldn't go back on his word, but he did make them slaves. He didn't kill them. Then he defeats the 5 Amorite kings. From there, he launches a southern campaign against Lachish, Hebron, and Gaza. So all the way here to Gaza. Then in the northern campaign, he moves from Gilgal all the way up to Hazor. So those are the 3 parts of his campaign. And then that enables the 12 tribes of Israel to settle into the land. They haven't conquered all of it at this point, but here's the boundaries of the 12 tribes. You can see some of them are larger than others because they had more people in those tribes. Remember, in the 12 tribes of Israel, there's one tribe that doesn't get land. Who's that? The Levites. Why?
Because they were priests.
Yes. They were told, your portion is not land, your portion is God. But we still have 12 tribes here. So where'd the other tribe come from?
Joseph's sons.
Right, Joseph was divided into 2 tribes for his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Here's Manasseh, and Ephraim's down here. So that's how it breaks out for the 12 tribes. I think did I skip over, I remember talking about theocracy with you. Back under the Hebrews, we have Abraham, of Ur, bondage in Egypt, and then theocracy before we got to the Promised Land. What is a theocracy? I should mention that real quickly. What's a theocracy?
Government under God.
Right. Theos is God. Krasi is rule or government. So it's ruled by God. What God intended for the Israelites to do is to live under His rule. And so from the time they leave Egypt until the time they get in the Promised Land and into the Promised Land, God is their king. They are supposed to recognize Him as their ruler. Moses is a spokesman, Joshua is a leader, but God is the one who is the ruler. Unfortunately, they come to forget that, as we see in the book of Judges, and things go downhill because of that. They are not following God, and we're going to see tomorrow some of the results of that. Tomorrow we're also going to look at some of the tribes that were around them as they settled the land, because they are going to continue to cause problems for them. All right, do you have any question about the condition of the land when the Israelites came, what they had to do, the distinctiveness of the Hebrew people, anything that we've gone over today? All right, we're going to get back into some Bible reading tonight. I want you to read Judges chapters 1 through 11. Judges 1 through 11. And we're going to see what the conditions were like after they get settled in the land, and do they continue to follow God as their ruler.
Where was David when it was the battle with Goliath? Like,
Yep.
where was he before he went there?
Where was David? David lived in the area near Bethlehem, so he was down in this area. The Valley of Elah is where he fights Goliath, but I'm not sure exactly where the Valley of Elah is. Does anybody else know where it's located? Okay. Answer your question the best as I can. So I'm not sure how far away it was. I don't see it on here.
Why are those two split up? The
Manasseh?
Yeah.
Apparently, there are a lot of people in the tribe of Manasseh, and they needed that much land, and apparently a lot of them wanted to settle on this side of the Jordan, and others went on this side. So that's the only thing I could say is Manasseh must have had a lot of people. Any other questions? It does bring up questions. We'll look at this too. Well, here's the city of Dan, but the tribe of Dan is down here. Look how Gad's kind of shaped funny.
But there's one else that much.
Yeah, this whole thing is about the size of New Jersey.
So,